I put this question to Dr. Stephen Meyer, author of the paper that originally got Dr. Sternberg in so much trouble. Newton is buried in the geniuses corner at Westminster Abbey, right?
That's correct, yeah. Darwin is also buried in Westminster Abbey.
Right, and yeah. So is Darwin. Right near each other, right? And you're here in Redmond, in a little building without a sign.
I don't get it, Stein. Were you implying that his glowing success from forgetting that the early Earth has a reducing atmosphere deserves better treatment, or was that a tongue-in-cheek shot at how much Meyer sucks?
Right. And you're obviously an incredibly smart guy, but how dare you challenge someone who's buried in the geniuses corner next to Newton at Westminster Abbey?
Oh, I see. It was a poorly veiled strawman argument. He set up the strawman that Myers was discredited for questioning the work of geniuses and attacked it rather easily. Well, let's examine that strawman, shall we? In the mid-1900s, a humble-mustached German patent office clerk questioned the work of another fellow buried in Westminster Abbey, Isaac Newton. Was he discredited? You decide.
And what I found in studying the structure of the argument in The Origin of Species is that for every evidence-based argument for one of Darwin's two key propositions, there is an evidence-based counter-argument.
Said the silly little man that doesn't realize oxygen is essential to multicellular life.
In any case, the debate really isn't going to be settled by numbers. It's going to be settled by the evidence and the arguments.
While I was still in Bill Gates country, Dr. Meyer recommended I check in with molecular biologist Jonathan Wells. What kind of names do they call you?
Creationist.
Melodramatic gasp!
What do you say back to them when they say you're a creationist?
Well, I usually don't get the opportunity.
Poor guy. I'd be upset if somebody called me a creationist too. Of course I didn't misrepresent good science. Jonathan Wells is, perhaps, most known for writing the book Icons of Evolution. In the Icons of Evolution, Mr. Wells proceeds to attack various bits of evidence for evolution, which he refers to as icons. One of these icons would be the Miller-Urey experiment. See, in the 1970s, scientists cracked open a piece of amber to study the gases trapped inside in much the same way that scientists study the bubbles in ice core samples. What they found was, inside the bubbles, the air was rich in oxygen, which is quite unlike the atmosphere used in the Miller-Urey experiment. This is rather suggestive, as it would indeed invalidate the findings of the Miller-Urey experiment, were it only true. They did indeed find oxygen-rich gas trapped in amber, but there are two things wrong with this picture. Number one, trees complete with sap evolved long after the Cambrian explosion, and thus a while after the atmosphere was oxygen-enriched. Trees actually appear in the Carboniferous period. Number two, it's been found that the act of crushing amber causes a reaction that releases oxygen gas. Recent findings have suggested that there was more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than Miller thought. By including carbon dioxide in the early atmosphere simulation, the diversity of organic molecules produced actually increased. And even more recent findings suggest an abundance of hydrogen gas. This would have made the Earth even more hospitable to the formation of life. The second icon is the Tree of Life. Mr. Wells claims all groups of animals emerged during the Cambrian. Firstly, he fails to define group. I believe what he is referring to is the various phylums, and if he is, his knowledge is out of date. Animals used to be attached to a phylum based on how much they look like creatures within that phylum. Since then, concrete definitions of various phylums have been laid down, and it's been demonstrated that although many phyla did emerge during the Cambrian, quite a few are extinct, and several modern phyla have emerged since then. Mr. Miller then goes on with a direct lie. He says that scientists have been comparing the DNA of various animals, and the findings have contradicted the Tree of Life. He couldn't be more wrong. The third icon is homologous structures. He claims that it contains circular reasoning. In reality, it's a tautological definition. Homologous structures have similar bone structures. Thus, the statement that they have similar bone structures, therefore the structures are homologous, is not begging the question. Rather, it's tautological. He also has a picture of embryos set side by side from a textbook pointing at various homologous structures, one of these being gill slits. He is correct to say that humans never have gills. This is true. These aren't exactly even rudimentary gills in that they don't function as gills. Fish embryos have them too. Unlike fish, the pharyngeal arches of humans don't develop into functional gills. Rather, they become cartilage structures in the jaw and neck. The point of the comparison, though, is that both structures start out similarly, then go in different directions. He next goes on to attack Haeckel's embryos. What's more, he's correct. At least in the sense that Haeckel did his drawings incorrectly to make them look more similar. That's why most textbooks nowadays use photomicrographs, actual pictures of embryos laid side by side for comparison. True, they're not as similar as Haeckel's drawings, however, it would take a blind man to say that there's no similarities whatsoever. The fifth icon is the Archaeopteryx. Wells quote mines a few scientists saying they're not sure if birds descended from Archaeopteryx. In context, the scientists are simply not sure whether Archaeopteryx was the direct ancestor of modern birds, or if modern birds simply share an ancestor with the Archaeopteryx. Regardless of which, it's indisputed within the scientific community that even if birds only shared an ancestor with the Archaeopteryx, the divergence would not have happened long before the arrival of the Archaeopteryx. Essentially, the very sources he uses undermines Wells' own argument. It's like arguing that someone didn't descend from their great-great-great-grandfather because their great-uncle was accidentally listed as their grandfather on a family tree. See, whichever was the ancestor of that generation, both stem from the same great-grandfather, and both come from the same great-great-great-grandfather. Wells also states that Archaeopteryx predates its ancestors by a couple dozen million years. I think that may be some confusion on his part. Dromaeosauridae predate Archaeopteryx by about that much time. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and call that error, not intentional misrepresentation of science. The sixth icon cited by Wells is the experiments from Kettlewell performed on pepper moths. He states that peppered moths were glued to the trunks and that they always rest in unexposed areas. This may have come from a 1985 study by Clark, but the allegation that moths were posed is reminiscent of a creationist propaganda film called Evolution vs. Creationism by Janet Folger. In any case, had Mr. Wells kept up with his research, he'd know that his source has been since invalidated by several studies from Majerus. A sample study from Majerus. 23 moths are observed resting naturally. 1 was found on the exposed trunk. 3 were found resting on branches close to the trunk, and the remainder were found resting on exposed sections of the branches. For the record, moths are camouflaged just as well in the visible and ultraviolet spectrums on the trunk as they are in the branches. Thus, Kettlewell's study remains valid. Moths are subjected to predation based on their camouflage. Wells goes on to challenge the study on the basis of failure to control variables. Wells says that moths were released and captured during the daytime and thus were not subjected to predation while flying. His concern, though, is invalid. Moths are indeed subjected to predation primarily from bats during the night. Insectivorous bats find prey by echolocation, and moth color will have no noticeable effect on animals that hunt by sound. It's kinda hard to hear in color. As such, the effects of night predation are equal to both color morphs, as bats can detect dark morphs just as easily as light morphs. Any difference in predation will happen during and only during the day. The seventh icon is Darwin's finches. Wells refers to a 70s study that showed beak length increasing by 5% in a drought, and says that a 1999 study that referred to it was incorrect because it failed to mention that beak length returned to normal later on.